Hello and welcome back, everyone. Thank you for joining us again on We the Podcast. I am your host, Jesse Rude. Before we dive in today, I want to ask you all to just take a second to support what we're building here. If you're watching on YouTube or Rumble, please make sure to like, follow, and subscribe. It helps it helps this show reach more people who care about the constitutional government and serious discussion. So, with that being said, uh, if you want to go deeper on these themes, party realignment, constitutional fidelity, and what happens when principles are traded for power, I'd encourage you all to check out my new book, The Last Republican, Thomas Massey and the Death of a Party. You can get the book on Amazon or on Barnes& and Noble. It is available now and it expands on many of the ideas that we talk about on this show. Tonight, we're going to be talking about something that doesn't make headlines the way elections or culture wars or wars generally make the headlines, but it quietly shapes every single one of those things. It's the federal budget and the fiscal cliff that we are steadily walking towards. This isn't a sky is falling episode. It's not about panic. It's about math, incentives, and trends, and what happens when we ignore them for long enough. Right now, the United States is spending more money than it takes in, year after year. That alone isn't new. You know it. We all know it. But what is new is the trajectory that we are currently on, where interest on the debt is growing so fast that if nothing changes, it will eventually rival or exceed federal revenue itself. At that point, we are no longer budgeting for the future, we are servicing the past. And here's the key question this episode is built around: how did we get here? Why does it matter constitutionally? And what happens when a government loses the ability to choose how it spends its own money? Because when interest becomes the first obligation, not defense, not infrastructure, not even basic governance, then the real decisions stop being made by elected representatives and start being made by arithmetic. Tonight, we're going to break this down plainly. No partisan spin, just the numbers, the structure, and the long term consequences if we keep doing exactly what we are doing now. So, before we can speak about the fiscal cliff, we have to get everyone on the same page about two words that get thrown around like they mean the same thing. They don't: deficit and debt. The deficit is what happens in a single year. It's the gap between what the federal government brings in for revenue and what it spends in expenditures. If the government collects $3 trillion and spends $5 trillion, you've got a deficit of $2 trillion. That seems basic, but it's important to emphasize for the foundation of this episode. The debt is the running total of those deficits stacked year after year plus interest. So when you hear somebody say that we added $1 trillion this year, that's a deficit problem. When you hear we're sitting on tens of trillions of dollars of debt, that's the accumulation of many years of the deficits. Now, here's why it matters. If deficits were rare, if we overspent only in a true emergency and then paid it down in good times, that would be one thing. But deficits have become normal, routine, they're built in. And once deficits become routine, the debt doesn't just grow in a straight line. It grows like a snowball rolling down a hill. Because debt doesn't just sit there. It's not an idle number. Debt has a monthly cost. It's interest. And I want to pause on that because interest is where this conversation changes. A lot of government spending is debated. It gets voted on. It's political. You can argue about it. You can ask yourself, is it necessary? Is it not? Interest is not like that. Interest is the bill that comes due because of choices already made. It's not an opinion. It's not a campaign promise. It's an obligation. This means even if Washington decided tomorrow to get serious, even if they froze spending in place, even if they did not create a single new program, interest would still keep growing as long as the debt keeps growing. And as long as rates stay elevated, the interest will only continue to climb with the debt. So, this is the first big idea for tonight. The fiscal cliff isn't mainly about one bad vote or one bad Congress or one bad president. It's about a structure that has built in momentum, a momentum that's very hard to stop. Now, let's bring this down from Washington to real life. If you have a credit card and you keep carrying a balance month after month, you're not just paying on what you bought, you're paying on the privilege of not paying it off. That interest charge becomes a permanent line item in your budget. And eventually you reach a point where you are working not to build something, but to service what you already owe. That's the very same danger with government debt. The only difference is that you don't feel the immediate impact of the government debt. Once interest becomes large enough, it doesn't just take up some space of the budget. It starts competing with everything else. If this is where it starts getting that crowding effect. You don't have to agree with any particular program to understand the math. If more of the budget is locked up in mandatory obligations and interest, then there's less room for everything else, no matter who wins elections. It's a trap disguised as normal. Now, if you want to address something you'll hear online, especially, people will oftentimes say, national debt doesn't matter, or we can just print more, or it's all fake anyway. But here's what I say to that. You don't need a doomsday scenario to admit that debt changes incentives. When debt gets too large, leaders stop making decisions based on what's best. They start making decisions based on what's necessary to keep the machine from stalling. That's how you lose freedom without a headline. Now, what does this have to do with the dollar? Because when government borrowing expands faster than productive growth, and when deficit becomes permanent, it puts pressure on the currency in a few ways. The first, it increases the temptation to solve political problems with monetary tricks and not or not talking about conspiracy. I'm talking about incentives. So these tricks, examples of these tricks are the fluctuation of the interest rates. Those are tricks they try to do to temporarily solve problems. Another incentive is simple. Borrowing avoids immediate pain. It allows policymakers to fund priorities today without asking voters to accept higher taxes or visible cuts now. A third is short-term stability. When debt levels are high, leaders become focused on keeping the system functioning quarter to quarter, sometimes at the expense of long-term soundness. Next, it erodes confidence over time, not in a dramatic way, but in a slow way. And lastly, it shows up in your life as a loss of purchasing power, what your money can buy. Inflation becomes a kind of hidden tax. It's not voted on, it's not debated, but it takes a bite out of savings, wages, retirement, especially for those on fixed income. So when we talk about the fiscal cliff, I'm not trying to scare anybody into thinking the country disappears next week. The danger isn't a collapse tomorrow. The danger is that we slowly build a system where the budget becomes rigid, where choices disappear, where the government is basically running on autopilot because interest and mandatory spending eat the room for decision making. And that's the line I want you to remember from this segment. The danger isn't that the system collapses tomorrow. It's that little by little it loses flexibility until there are no real choices left to make. So, if this is the modern picture, what did the people who built our American system think about debt in the first place? To understand why this mattered so much to the people who designed our system, we have to take a step back. Before trillion-dollar budgets, before central banking as we know it, and ask a simple question. What did our founding fathers think about debt itself? One of the things that frustrates me the most about modern politics is how often we hear that our budget problems are new or they don't matter, that we can just continue to spend and not worry about the consequences later. The truth is quite literally the opposite. The founders spoke about debt constantly because they understood something we've largely forgotten. Debt is not a financial tool, it's a political force. Debt changes what a government is willing to do, it changes who it answers to, and over time, it changes how free a people can remain. Now, the founders are not absolutists. They didn't believe government, or they didn't believe government debt was always wrong. They understood that borrowing could be necessary in a true emergency, or especially during war. But they also believed something else just as strongly. Debt should be temporary. It should be limited. It should be paid down once the emergency passes. James Madison did not hedge on this point at all. Writing in the National Gazette on February 20th, 1792, he warned about the danger of public debt in a republic and said this: public debt is a public curse, and in a Republican government, a greater evil than any other. Madison's concern wasn't that debt could cause an immediate collapse. It was that permanent debt quietly concentrates power, shifting responsibility forward in time, and undermines Republican government. Thomas Jefferson went even further and developed the idea of intergenerational responsibility. He wrote to James Madison on September 6th, 1789. He argued that one generation does not have the moral authority to bind another indefinitely through debt. Jefferson put it this way: the earth belongs always to the living generation. No generation can contract debts greater than may be paid during the course of its own existence. In Jefferson's view, permanent debt was not just bad economics, it was a moral violation of consent across time. In other words, permanent debt means permanent obligation for people who never consented to it. And that is where the liberty question comes in. If you and I sign a contract, we are consenting adults. But when the government borrows massively and permanently, it's not just asking us to pay. It's an obligation that our children and their children, and now their children in addition, must pay. That's not taxation without representation in the classic sense, but it's close in spirit. It binds people who never agreed to the deal. And the founders understood that debt invites temptation. It encourages leaders to spend now and worry later. It rewards short term thinking and creates incentives to hide costs rather than confront them. And on that note, our founding fathers spoke very frequently about that topic as well. Our system was designed to be slow and well thought out. But you see the same reflection when you look at our legislative system. We no longer think about the issues. We never look at the short term and long term effects. We just look at the short term thinking. And we rapidly pass legislation without even reading what's in it sometimes. That is the exact opposite of a system that our founding fathers designed. The, the founding fathers understood that debt invites temptation. It encourages leaders for that short term thinking, like I had just mentioned. That's why they built friction into the system. Congress was given control of the purse not because they tolerated bureaucracy, but because they opposed it. The founding fathers did not view bureaucracy as a neutral administrative tool, they saw it as a threat. Congress was never meant to delegate its core authority away to unelected bodies. The power of the purse was supposed to remain with the people's representatives precisely to prevent a permanent administrative class from governing by regulation instead of law. What we have today would have been unrecognizable to them. I like to call it a de facto fourth branch of government, a bureaucratic branch that writes rules, enforces them, and often uh, adjudicates them, all while insulated from direct accountability. Our founding fathers wanted a system where we could hold our representatives accountable. They wanted the money to matter. This wasn't an accident in the Constitution, it was a violation of it. They wanted debate, they wanted accountability, they wanted every dollar to feel heavy. The modern system has flipped that logic. Borrowing is now treated like a normal revenue source. Emergencies never end. The debt is no longer something we escape, it's something we manage. So the real question isn't whether our founding fathers would have understood today's number. The question is whether they would recognize our habits as dangerous. And based on what they wrote, based on the system they designed, I would say the answer is clearly yes. Because the founders did not assume perfect leaders. They assumed flawed humans and they built a constitution to limit the damage. So what happens when those limits erode? What happens when debt becomes permanent and discipline becomes optional? We get the fiscal cliff that we were speaking about today. Now we need to talk about the other side of the ledger, revenue. And this is where the picture often looks healthier than it actually is, and it does not look very healthy. When people hear federal revenue, they tend to think of it as money that's available to be spent. But a large portion of that is counted as revenue and is already spoken for. In other words, we're talking about pre-accounted for money. Some revenue is meant to fund the general operations of government, such as income tax, corporate tax, excise, tariffs, etc. That's the money Congress is supposed to debate and appropriate. But other inflows come with obligations attached. They are collected with a promise. Social Security is the clearest example of that. The payroll taxes are presented as contributions to a self-sustaining system, one you pay into while you work and draw from later in life. That distinction matters because money collected with a promised future benefit is not the same thing as free and available revenue. Yet on the federal balance sheet, these trust-style inflows are often counted as part of overall revenue, and that creates a misleading picture. It makes the government appear to have more spending capacity than it actually does, because some of that money already has a claim to it. This is where we need to introduce another concept that is rarely discussed: unfunded liabilities. Unfunded liabilities are promises the government has already made but does not have money set aside to fully pay for. Programs like Social Security and Medicare are the biggest examples. People pay into them with the expectation of future benefits. But when you actually run the numbers, long term, the promises made are larger than the money set aside to pay for them. And that gap is just another form of debt. It doesn't show up in the same way Treasury bonds do. but it represents real future claims on a revenue. So when we talk about debt, it is important to understand that we're not just talking about what has been borrowed. We're talking about the promises that have been made but not fully funded. When those obligations are treated as revenue and their costs pushed into the future by borrowing against them, the budget stops reflecting reality. So let's put some real numbers to this. In the most recent fiscal year, the federal government brought in just under $5 trillion in total revenue. That may sound like a lot until you break it down. Roughly 1.5 trillion of that, so a third of it, 33% of our revenue, comes from the payroll taxes. Those are the taxes taken directly out of our paycheck that are supposed to pay for Social Security and Medicare. That means $1.5 trillion of what's counted for in our federal budget is money that's already promised a destination. It's not discretionary, it's not flexible, it's already claimed. And that's before we even talk about the fact that these programs still owe far more in future benefits than they currently have set aside. So here's what that actually looks like in plain terms. Under current law, the federal government has already promised far more in future benefits. For Social Security, the promised benefits exceed $25 trillion over the next 75 years. For Medicare, the gap is even larger. It's more than $50,000 in promised benefits that are not fully funded. So we have between $75 and $80 trillion of unfunded obligations, commitments already made without the money reserved to meet them. That figure is larger than the official national debt. It's more than double. And while it doesn't show up on the debt clock, it represents a real future claim on federal revenue. Those numbers come directly from Social Security and Medicare trustees' reports and are summarized by organizations like the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget and the American Action Forum. So here's the reality once you strip away the accounting. On paper, the government collects $5 trillion. But once you remove the payroll taxes that are already committed to Social Security and Medicare, the government's effective revenue is much closer to $3.5 trillion. And that distinction matters because it means the federal government's real purchasing power is far smaller than the headline number suggests. And every obligation we've talked about is competing for a much narrower pool of money. And every time the federal government borrows against Medicare and Social Security, the gap grows larger and unfunded liabilities in our debt grows larger. Once revenue itself becomes blurred, we stop being honest about what's actually available. The next step is inevitable. Interest doesn't go away. It starts to dominate. So what's the budget reality? The top expenses versus revenue. Up to this point, we've spoken about the debt, incentives, revenue, and the structure of our spending. Now it's time to put hard numbers on the table. Because once you see the actual breakdown of federal spending, a lot of political arguments stop sounding serious. When people imagine the federal budget, they often picture thousands of small programs fighting over scraps. That's not how it works. The federal government is dominated by only a handful of massive obligations, and everything else fights for what's left. So let's walk through this one by one. For the top 5 expenses, number 1 is Social Security. Social Security alone costs roughly $1.5 trillion per year. Remember that this program was designed to be self-funded through payroll taxes. But because those payroll taxes are now counted as general revenue, Social Security must also now be counted as an expenditure as well. That means Social Security inflates the revenue number and it dominates the expenditure side. Second on the list is Medicare. Medicare costs about $1.1 trillion per year and is growing faster than almost anything else in our budget. Unlike Social Security, large parts of Medicare are funded directly from the general revenue, which means they compete head to head with everything else that the government wants to do. Third on the list is interest on our debt. Interest has overtaken our national military budget. Interest costs have climbed to match Medicare at $1.1 trillion per year. And unlike every other category that we're talking about, interest doesn't buy us anything. It doesn't build roads. It doesn't defend the country. It doesn't provide services. It's simply the price of past borrowing. And next on the list is national defense. National defense spending recently crossed that $1 trillion mark as well. It's hovering just barely over $1 trillion. And there have been recent calls to push military spending even higher, with proposals reaching as much as $1.5 trillion to match Social Security in the coming years. That kind of increase doesn't require a new war. It's the compounding effect of commitments, modernization plans, and global posture decisions. And last in the top 5 is Medicaid and other federal health programs. Together, these cost roughly $800 billion per year. Again, these are not optional line items. These are baked-in commitments. Just those 5 categories alone consume well over $5 trillion a year, roughly equal, maybe even a little greater than the government's entire headline revenue. And that's before we talk about education. That's before we talk about infrastructure, veterans benefits, science, transportation, or anything else people argue about on cable news. This is why the deficit exists. Not because of one reckless program, not because of one administration, but because the government has locked itself into structural obligations that exceed the real revenue. That means these core obligations alone already exceed what the government can realistically afford. This is where the illusion of choice disappears. Every budget debate you see is really a fight over the margins, over what gets squeezed after mandatory spending and interest takes their cut. And that's the key takeaway from this segment. That's why we face a budgetary crisis. Every year, Congress must vote on a new omnibus bill. By the time Congress even starts debating priorities, most of the money is already spoken for. That's not ideology, it's arithmetic. Once you see how much of the budget is locked in, the next question becomes unavoidable. Where does this go if nothing fundamentally changes? Now that we've laid out where we are today, we need to talk about where this goes if nothing changes. This is the part of the conversation most people avoid, not because it's complicated, but because it's uncomfortable. So I want to be very clear about something up front. There is no single year where the system suddenly collapses. There's no movie-style movement where the lights go out. The fiscal cliff is a trajectory problem. It's what happens when compounding interest grows faster than the government's ability to raise revenue. So let's walk through this in a simple 5-year step program. Not because the exact dollar amounts matter, but because the direction does. Right now, the total debt is already measured at $38 trillion. If current deficit persists and at conservative levels, the debt continues climbing every year. 5 years out, you're not talking about a small increase. You're talking about tens of trillions of dollars added to the debt. And remember, every new dollar of debt comes with monthly cost. Interest doesn't compound emotionally. It compounds mathematically. At today's debt levels, interest has already become one of the largest line items in the federal budget. But here's the key point. interest grows automatically. It doesn't need a vote, it doesn't need a new program. As long as debt rises, as long as rates stay anywhere near historical norms, interest keeps accelerating. 5 years from now, interest isn't just competing with defense, it's competing with Medicare. 10 years from now, it begins competing with Social Security. And at some point along the path, interest stops being just another expense, it becomes a constraint. Now let's talk about revenue growth, because this is where optimism usually enters the conversation. You'll hear arguments that economic growth will solve this, that, excuse me, that revenue will grow fast enough to outrun the problem. But here's the reality. Even under optimistic assumptions, revenue trends to grow gradually. Debt and interest does not. They grow exponentially. That means the gap doesn't close over time, it widens. And this is the heart of the fiscal cliff. It's the moment when interest meaningfully constrains all other choices, not because Congress wants it to, but because there's no other alternative. When interest becomes non negotiable, everything else becomes optional. Programs don't get debated on their merits, they get evaluated based on what can be delayed, underfunded, or quietly cut. And that's when budgeting stops being a democratic process and starts being an exercise of damage control. You may wonder when we actually reach the fiscal cliff. I can't give you an exact date because it depends on interest rates, growth, political decisions, how fast we spend the money. But we can talk about the direction and we can talk about orders of magnitude. Right now, interest costs are already running about $1.1 trillion a year. If debt continues to grow at anything like its current pace, and if interest rates remain near historical norms, interest costs will continue compounding much faster than revenue. On the trajectory, interest payments alone begin consuming essentially all federal revenue sometime in the early to mid 2040s. That's not a sudden crash. It's a slow squeeze. Long before interest reaches 100% of revenue, it crowds out defense. It crowds out healthcare, infrastructure, and everything else. Many people say that we need a strong military budget to defend against threats. But if we keep spending like this, we will have no budget for the military within 20 years. So the fiscal cliff isn't a single moment on the calendar. It's the point where interest becomes the first claim on every dollar the government collects. And once you reach that point, policy choices stop being choices. If the trajectory is the problem, then the real debate isn't whether we can change course, but whether we are willing to. If the fiscal cliff is driven by structural spending, then the only honest fix starts with the simple question: what is the federal government actually authorized to spend money on? The Constitution does not give Congress a general power to provide whatever services it wants, whenever it wants, or for however long it wants. It gives enumerated powers, specific authorities listed in Article 1, Section 8. That means the federal government is supposed to be limited by design. And when spending breaks free from that design, it's not just a constitutional problem. It becomes a math problem because there is no natural stopping point. So let's draw a bright line. And to understand where that line comes from, it's important to hear from the founding fathers themselves. James Madison addressed this exact issue while defending the Constitution in Federalist 41. Critics argued that the power to tax and spend for the general welfare gave Congress unlimited authority. Madison rejected that interpretation outright. Here's what he wrote: some who have denied the necessity of the power of taxation have grounded a very fierce attack against the Constitution on the language in which it is defined. It has been urged and echoed that the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, to pay the debts, and provide for the common defense and general welfare amounts to an unlimited commission. Had no other enumeration or definition of the powers of Congress been found in the Constitution, then the general expressions just cited, the authors of the objection might have had some reason for their attacks. But the reason can be objected when a specification of the objects alluded to by the general terms immediately follows and is not even separated by a longer pause than a semicolon. For the purpose could the enumeration of particular powers be inserted. If these and all others were meant to be included in the preceding general power, nothing is more natural nor common than the first use of the general phrase, and then to explain and qualify it by recital of particulars. Madison's point was explicit. The so-called general welfare language was never an independent spending authority. It was limited, explained, and constrained by the specific powers that followed. When I say constitutional spending, I mean that it is directly tied to the powers that are clearly spelled out in the Constitution, just like Madison was saying. Not good intentions, not helpful, not popular. Spending that is tied to actual and enumerated authority. Here are the big buckets that are the easiest to defend as constitutional because they flow straight from the text and structure of the document. National defense, the raising and supporting of armies, maintaining a navy, providing for national security. The federal courts, and enforcement of federal law, because the Constitution creates a federal judiciary system and federal crimes and duties. Foreign relations and diplomacy, treaties, embassies, legitimate national level statecraft. Core operations of the federal government, Congress, the executive departments that carry out enumerated duties, and basic administrations. Paying debts lawfully incurred, because defaulting on debts is not fiscal discipline, it's national dishonor. And yes, there are areas where people argue about the boundary. For example, infrastructure that clearly connects to postal roads, interstate commerce, or navigation. But the point is this: even the reasonable disagreements at the edges, the Constitution does not authorize Washington to be a permanent national service provider or for social and economic problems. Now let's define the other side. When I say unconstitutional spending, I'm talking about programs that don't have clear enumerated hooks. Programs that functionally belong to the states, local communities, or civil society. And I'm going to say something that matters here. Calling a program unconstitutional is not the same thing as saying that the people who rely on it do not matter. It means the responsibility was moved to the wrong level of government and that the Constitution's limits were treated as optional. Now, here's the part that most politicians will never say out loud. If you're serious about shrinking the deficit without gutting core constitutional functions, You start here because this is where the money is. Let's put the real numbers on it. Using the federal government's own 2024 outlay breakdown, total spending was roughly $6.75 trillion. Now watch what happens when we separate the budget into two piles. One pile, the core functions that are easiest to defend constitutionally. Defense, veterans, courts, justice, core government, operations, and foreign relations. Those categories combined for $1.39 trillion in 2024. $1.39 trillion. And we were just speaking about how if you take away the payroll tax, we generate a revenue of $3.5 trillion. That means we could theoretically be paying off over $1.5 trillion every year on our debt if we just cut the unconstitutional spending. Because the unconstitutional spending accounts for $4.48 trillion. That's the scale of what I am calling unconstitutional versus constitutional. $4.5 trillion. That number should change the way you hear every budget debate. Because it means this isn't a cut a little waste problem. It's a scope of government problem. The 10 biggest examples. Here's a list of the 10 biggest examples of programs that are not in our Constitution. Social Security, $1.5 trillion. Medicare, $900 billion. Medicaid and CHIP, $626 billion. Obamacare subsidies, $125 billion. Income security and welfare programs, $671 billion. Education, training, employment, and social services, $305 billion. Federal food assistance, SNAP alone, is $100 billion. Housing and related subsidies is tens of billions. Energy and industrial policy spending is tens of billions. And foreign aid is another tens of billions. And then there are the categories that's hardest to capture with one label, everything else. Regulatory agencies, grants, subsidies, bureaucratic expansion. That's the other pile. And the other pile is enormous. Why this matters. Restraint prevents default. Now let's bring this back to the cliff. People argue whether we have to default. We don't, if we have restraint. But restraint is not an option forever. Because if we keep spending and borrowing until interest costs consume 100% of the revenue, that is the day that the game is over. That is the day that nothing is left to pay down principal. Nothing is left to fund a core government. Nothing is left to respond to a crisis. At that point, you don't choose default. Default chooses you. So the real question isn't whether we can keep the current system alive. It's whether we are willing to shrink the system back inside the Constitution before the math forces it to happen the hard way. So to close for this evening, fiscal responsibility doesn't begin with sacrifice. It begins with legality. And the legality begins with limits. If we return to constitutional boundaries, we don't have to default. But if we keep ignoring those boundaries until interest consumes the entire revenue stream, then there is no later. There's no reversal. There's only default. I hope you all take something seriously out of this and try to start holding all of our representatives accountable, all of our leaders accountable, no matter the party affiliation. Because we are on a very dangerous path, and it's only about 20 years away before we really start seeing a crunch. So, again, thank you all for watching. Please like, subscribe, share, and please check out my book on Thomas Massey. I feel like he's the last principled member of Congress that we have, and then probably Rand Paul on the Senate side. So please check out that book. It explains all of his core principles. It explains what makes Thomas Massey who he is, and it'll really help me out. And I'm pledging 50% of my profits to Thomas Massey's campaign. So the more sales I get, you'll get a book and you'll get to help out his campaign.